So have your Bibles out and this long note sheet that we've got today. It's going to be our roadmap for this important time of teaching. Back when I was in college, back in the 1980s, I had gotten my life with Jesus back on track, and I was going all out for Jesus. I was part of a number of campus Bible studies and fellowship groups and meeting all kinds of Christians my own age. It was a very exciting time. It was also a time when the subject of the last days or the end times was especially common. It was a time of great uncertainty during the mid 80s. And in times when people are feeling down, interest in Jesus' return goes up. It's just part of human nature. These were the years of the Reagan presidency, and we were still coming out of a funk as a nation from the 1970s, Vietnam and Watergate and the oil embargoes, and then the Iran hostage crisis. And we were still in the thick of what was called the Cold War, this passive-aggressive conflict with the mighty Soviet Union. Nobody knew how it would all shake out. There's a writer named Hal Lindsey, and he had a cottage industry of writing books about the last days. His bestseller was The Late Great Planet Earth, and it was still flying off the shelves back in the 80s. There was even another guy who made a killing with a book called 88 Reasons Why Christ Will Return in 1988. And guess what? It had a sequel, 89 Reasons Why... Yeah, that one didn't sell as many copies, but I was all but convinced during this time that Jesus was saddling up his horse and was going to come back any day. I have vivid memories of walking on campus and kind of moping a little bit and talking to God in prayer and going, I'd really love it, Lord, if I could graduate and getting married would be nice. Could you just dawdle just a little bit? Had lots of conversations with friends about these topics. I remember talking about with some friends about who the Antichrist might be. I call it now, looking back at it, being part of the Antichrist of the Month Club. One of them would say, well, I think it's Prince Charles. Because this prophecy in Daniel says that the feet of the beast will be partly iron and partly clay. And did you know that under Buckingham Palace is iron from the Roman days and clay? Somebody else would pipe in and say, no, I think it's Mikhail Gorbachev. You see that mark on his face? You look at it from the right angle, it looks like 666. And that's how these crazy conversations sometimes went. Well, time went on. I graduated. Whoo! Got married. And then Mikhail Gorbachev turned out to be a pretty good fellow after all, with just an unfortunate birthmark. And then the Soviet Union collapsed. The Berlin Wall fell. The late 80s and the 90s turned out to be, honestly, a time of peace and prosperity unlike any that our nation had experienced in a long, long time. Well, then came 9/11, and all that talk surfaced again. Are these the last times? Are these the end times? Hey, did you see that face of the devil in the smoke at the World Trade Center? Any of you remember those things, those talks? But we got through that as well. Of course, this is right in the middle of the time when the Left Behind books were being churned out one after another. I think there were 50 of them altogether. But America went to war. We reset things. We rebuilt the Trade Center, and life went on. And then in 2008, we had the housing crisis. And again, once again, as we peered over the edge of looming disaster, all the conversations began to turn to these topics again. But the center held. We got through the worst of it. And 12 years later, in fact, on February 12th of this year, just a few weeks ago, the Dow Jones was sitting at its highest point ever, 29,500 points. But then out of nowhere, COVID-19 strolled into town, sporting a leather jacket and a sneer on his face and a cigarette dangling out of his mouth. And once again, the questions are flying all over the place. Lord, what's happening? What are you saying to us? Are these the last days? This morning and again next week and perhaps over the next couple weeks, I want to offer a crash course in what theologians call eschatology. It's based on a Greek word that simply means this. This would be the first fill-in on your note sheet. It's the study of last things. There's no doubt that eschatology brings out the weirdos, and so you need to be careful, and you should watch out for them. I read this last week of a preacher has some kind of national prominence saying that the coronavirus is actually a demon from ancient Egypt. Who knew? But rather than being a weird subject that proves how weird Christians are, eschatology flows directly out of how Christians view the unfolding of time and history. You may recall a couple weeks ago, we discussed how there are three prominent worldviews that are now clashing for the souls of the human race today. We have, on one hand, Eastern philosophy and religion, and we have naturalism/Darwinism, and then we also have the Judeo-Christian tradition. You think of how each of these view time and history. Eastern philosophy believes that time is circular, essentially going nowhere, which means that history is ultimately meaningless. Naturalism, Darwinism, regards time as linear, one event following another, but it too is meaningless because it basically ends in destruction. The death of the sun, a comet's going to crash into the earth, Yellowstone's going to pop off. Only Christianity offers something, a view of time, a view of history that is ultimately purposeful and meaningful. In Christianity, time is linear, but it is ascending with purpose and direction because God is behind it. And for that reason, history is, as we said a couple weeks ago, history is His story. And this morning I want to demonstrate this by doing a flyover, largely of the book of Genesis, interestingly enough. The first book in our Bibles. To do a proper study of eschatology, of last things, one must first do a study of the beginning of things. For most Christians that I've talked to, when they think of the last days, they're thinking about a very narrow sliver of time, right at the end of things, right before Jesus returns, a time that they've heard about, or they've read about, or they've seen a real bad Nicolas Cage movie about it, and they think that it's a time that'll be very dark. Evil will be running amok. The earth will be in the thrall of a diabolical power. And just when it couldn't get any worse, Jesus will come back and save the day. And that's as far as their thinking will take them. Very few people are thinking about God's big picture plan for this earth and where this vast sweep of history is taking us. In fact, very few Christians realize, are you ready for this bombshell? Very few Christians realize that right now we are in the last days since Jesus rose from the dead and sent His Spirit on the church. On the day the church was born and the Holy Spirit came on the first disciples in fire and in power from heaven, Peter stood up and he preached a sermon and explained what was happened. This verse is on your note sheet. And Peter says, this is what was said through the prophet Joel, that in the last days it shall be, God declares, that I'll pour my Spirit out on all flesh. The sending of the Spirit on the church was a flashing neon sign from God to the earth saying, you are now entering the last days. And if you see this and understand what we're going to talk about in the next few minutes this morning, what God's big picture plans are for this earth, then this little period of time we're in now that's very, very scary, very unsettling, won't seem quite so bad. Coronavirus, smoronavirus, you might think. So let's begin, as I said, and let's begin at the beginning. And I want us to ask a very important question. Why did God create us in the first place? What was the purpose for all of this? The Bible tells us in its very first chapter why we're here. Genesis 1:27 and 28. Verse 27, again, the verses are right in front of you. It says, so God created humans in His own image, which is a mind-blowing concept, and we'll unpack this in just a minute. And then verse 28, this very next verse, is one of the most astonishing verses in all of ancient literature. Verse 28 says, and God blessed them, and God said, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. I want you to underline that last part of the last sentence, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. These 11 words really are God's original mission statement for why He created us. God apparently knew Tony Morgan back then. I want to break these 11 words out so that we understand what's at the heart of these. First, it says God created us so that we would be fruitful. That doesn't mean we're going to go out and make babies. That's the next word, multiply. We'll get to that in a second. You and I were created to live fruitful lives. Well, what's that mean? Well, we need to slide back into verse 27 and talk for a minute about what it means to be made in God's image. There's so much here to grasp. It's not talking about a physical resemblance. Oh, God, you have 2 eyes and a nose and a bald spot and hair coming out of your ears. That's not what it means. I had a bamboo shoot coming out of my ears the other day. What's up with that? No, to be created in the image of God means a number of things. Here are 3 that I find just absolutely critical. Write these down. First, it means that we share with God a moral resemblance. In other words, we were created to reflect in our lives God's beauty, God's goodness, God's love, and God's truth. And I want you to imprint those four words on your mind right now, because we're going to return to them several times in this teaching. God's beauty, God's goodness, God's love, God's truth. Being created in the image of God means, secondly, that we share with God a rational resemblance. In creating humans, God gave us the capacity to reason in some fashion like He does. And this then allows us to learn and grow and study and discover and invent and create. To be created in the image of God, thirdly, means we share a spiritual resemblance with God. God has given us the capacity, and no other creature has this, to relate to Him, to know Him in a personal and real way. So let's put all these ideas together. And I want you to read this along with me. To live a fruitful life, then, is to use this moral heart of mine and this rational thinking brain of mine and this relational spirit of mine to grow God's love, God's goodness, God's truth, God's beauty on the earth. And that's why you and I are here. God could have just snapped His fingers and filled the earth with art and music and poetry and buildings and gardens and roads and theaters and restaurants. Man, He could have had Mozart playing in the Garden of Eden when Adam first walked into it. Hey, what's that, God? Oh, it's Mozart. Who's Mozart? Well, he hasn't been born yet. Instead, you understand what God was doing. God was saying to Himself at the very beginning, earth will be filled with my beauty, with my goodness, with my love, with my truth, but I'll bring it into existence through my children, through their gifts and their passions and their interests. And that's what it means to live a fruitful life. Be fruitful. Then, multiply. What's multiply mean? Well, it means, turn to those in your room right now and go like this, Things that you do in the merry month of May, things that will lead to the rise of the Coronials 9 months from now. That's what multiply means. But it's no small thing. To create strong marriages and strong families is the building blocks and the foundation of healthy communities and healthy culture. This is very much a part of the creation narrative. You attack the family, you minimize the family, you redefine the family. Societies are going to corrode from the inside out. Be fruitful, multiply. The next phrase is so poignant and it's so prophetic. Fill the earth. This also was God's plan from the beginning, that the earth would be filled, and in 2 ways. First, literally filling the earth by multiplying, making more of us, and then spreading out, like a Three Stooges said, and just filling the earth with people, settling across the entire planet. And it's interesting that God foresaw, 4,000 years ago at least, that we would do this at a time when there were scarcely any of us on the planet, living in tribes and living in tents. That God saw that humans would do this is yet another profound example of God's hand on the Bible here. We'd fill up the planet, and then the second way in which we'd fill the earth goes back to step 1. We would fill the earth with God's beauty, God's goodness, God's love, God's truth. And when it was all said and done, as God originally drew it up, this earth would be filled with the glory and splendor of God. That was how God originally conceived of this. And you might be thinking, oh, what might have been. But God, my friends, has not given up on this dream at all. In fact, He talks about it over and over again in the Bible. In the days of Moses, God spoke to Moses these words, Numbers 14:21. Truly as I live, all the earth will be filled with the glory of the Lord. In a prophecy about the age over which the future Messiah would rule, Isaiah said it again. For the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Habakkuk, the prophet, took these two verses and put them together. Habakkuk 2:14. For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Jesus put it this way. The meek will inherit the earth. Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. And one more word, subdue it. What's that mean? This points to how humans would fill the earth with God's glory and God's goodness. The Hebrew word for subdue is very, very rich, has many layers and textures to it. It means this, to tread down, to make a path, to press, to squeeze, to knead. It even means to bring into bondage, with the idea of being to tame what is wild. And in the early chapters of Genesis, we see little hints of what God means by us subduing the earth. Genesis 2:11 mentions a river flowing through the Garden of Eden. And it says, where there is gold, and the gold of that land is good. And so we see hints here of the mining of precious jewels and metals, of using the resources of the earth to create, shall we say, technology. God places the first humans in a garden and are commanded in chapter 2 and verse 15 to work it and keep it. Here we have echoes of the development of agriculture and forestry. Even the culinary arts and conservation are all found in this verse. Later in the chapter, you know the story, Adam names all the animals. Well, what's that pointing towards? It's pointing to biology. It's pointing to animal husbandry, zoology, and all the other ologies, all the ways in which science can be used to bless the earth. In chapter 4, we read of Jubal, who was the father of all who play the lyre and the pipe, the creation of music, the creation of art. And then we read of Tubal-Cain, who was a forger of all instruments of bronze and iron. We had a boy in my church in Connecticut who loved to play with big Tonka trucks, and I called him lovingly Tubal-Cain. Why don't parents name their kids that? Or the favorite name I have in all the Bible. Isaiah named one of his children Maher-Shalal-Hash-Baz. Why doesn't nobody ever use that name? Just wondering. So, to subdue the earth, get this, means that Adam and Eve weren't just supposed to lay back in a hammock in the Garden of Eden while the angels brought them pina coladas. Didn't mean they were just supposed to lay on a couch and binge watch Call the Midwife or the Tiger King. What were they to do? They were to work. They were to put their muscles and brains together to harness the resources of this earth for the purposes of enriching life and advancing life so that, here we go again, God's beauty, God's goodness, God's love, God's truth would grow on the earth. This was God's plan. And you can see, as we've described this, that in some fashion, all these thousands of years later, this is precisely what the human race has done. It's baked into us to be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it. My wife Janice and I, we went to Washington, D.C. on January 1st to look at museums for the day and then cap the night off by going to My Fair Lady at the Kennedy Center. Little did I know it would be the last day trip we would be privileged to take. But thinking back to that day, I remember marveling at the beauty of the architecture and the art in the museums and the airplanes flying over the Potomac, and then at the theater, the music and the dancing on stage. It was magnificent. I thought to myself, this is what God created us to do. But my reverie was quickly shattered as I walked around D.C. that day by the sound of a couple police sirens in the distance and coming across several homeless people. And then we walked by a man who was cursing at a child by him. And then there was the knowledge of all this political toxicity that existed in the city and has spread through the country and indeed has covered the earth. And little did anyone know, somewhere out there on January 1st, with this little baby virus kicking in diapers, about ready to emerge. And we think to ourselves, something is wrong. What would happen to God's original plan? Well, the Bible wastes no time in telling us what happened. And that's what I love about the Bible. It speaks truth to us about what human life is like, about what the earth is like. Let's continue our journey through Genesis. In Genesis 3, just 3 chapters in, the first humans that God created, with a little outside prodding from some outside evil, they convince themselves that God's trying to rip them off. Who does he think he is? God telling us what's right and wrong. We'll decide what's right and wrong for ourselves. We don't need a God telling us what to do. And a cancer of the soul, the Bible calls it sin, an inward attraction to evil, a magnetic bent toward selfishness, and an automatic pushing away of God takes permanent root within us. We evict God from our hearts, and in the process, we evict ourselves from paradise. This Christian doctrine of sin, rather than being a hopelessly old-fashioned and naive, backwards idea, as many say, it's honestly one of the most provable of Christian doctrines. Good is in us, but we are not good. I look in the mirror honestly, and the reflection I see looking back is a reflection that is broken, a reflection that is in need of redemption, a reflection of a person who needs rescue. Yet, amazing love, amazing grace, how sweet the sound, even at the moment of our rebellion, the same chapter that describes humanity's fall declares, is a place where God declares that He will rescue us. He will crush the head of evil, though it will take suffering to pull it off. It's just a small whisper of hope that will take shape a few chapters later. But in the meantime, now, we have a huge problem. Do you know what the problem is? What problem are we left with by the end of Genesis chapter 3? We are still wired to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it. Only now, instead of spreading exclusively God's beauty, goodness, love, and truth. We still do some of that because we still bear the image of God, though that image is like a cracked mirror now with entire pieces missing. We still are capable of doing good. But now in our fallen condition, guess what else we spread? Evil. And there it is in Genesis 4. Cain murders his brother Abel, which then sets up a template that will run throughout history, the clash of good and evil within our hearts and within our families and within our communities. And more often than not, evil will seem to overpower the good. After a handful of generations that are chronicled in Genesis chapter 5, we come to Genesis 6, where we read these words. They're on your note sheet. When man began to multiply on the face of the land, the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. The story tells us that the wickedness became so great that there was only one faithful man left. And so, before evil could snuff out goodness for good, God intervenes. He orders a reboot, I guess you could say. He levels the playing field. He washes the slate clean, quite literally. And Genesis 6-9 tells us the story, the tragic story of Noah and the great flood. And then in this story, we see another template of truth that runs throughout the Bible. The pattern of God using some form of earthly catastrophe as a judgment against evil, which leads, ironically, to the growth or reemergence of goodness. When God exercises judgment, I heard someone once say, it is a severe mercy. Genesis 10 shows us the population of the earth growing again after Noah. Dozens upon dozens of nations emerged from Noah and his sons. But the flood did not wash away our sin nature. The inner selfishness and evil is still there. All the while we're multiplying and filling the earth. We're still running from God. We're still taking His laws and saying, don't need this. We're still filling the earth as a result with more evil than good. I mean, this is a bad Geico commercial. It's what we do. In Genesis 11 is a fascinating story that symbolizes all of this, a story called the Tower of Babel. Some of you say Babel, we don't know what it is. As humans come together and they build a great tower into heaven as a sign of their independence, their autonomy from God. And what does God do in the story? He breaks up the Yankees. Hmm? He confuses their language, the story tells us, so they can't understand one another, and in their frustration, they all drift apart from each other and spread out into different nation groups. This is a strange story, and you might be saying, that was mean of God. Why did you do that? This too, though, was a severe mercy. And in a way, because of COVID-19, we can understand this story in kind of a new way. You see, God was actually practicing a form of social distancing with the human race at this time. Think of the evil, the sin that's in us, like a virus. If humans are all together in one place, all speaking one language, all sharing our technology, what will happen to the virus of sin that is within us? It will spread like a wildfire. Well, how do you keep evil from spreading so fast? How do you keep a virus from spreading so fast? You quarantine us. You break us into groups. And how do you keep evil from spreading so fast? It's what the Tower of Babel story is all about. You break humanity up into different groups. That way, if the virus of sin breaks out in one culture and wreaks havoc on it, it won't infect all the others. God can deal with Sodom and Gomorrah and won't have to deal with Lebanon and the Philistines. The Tower of Babel is another fascinating story, but it points to God's mercy, God protecting us from ourselves to keep the spiral of evil in check. But, and here's the first good news we come to in the Bible story. The dividing of the nations at this moment is the beginning of God setting into motion His great rescue mission for the earth that He first promised in Genesis chapter 3. This rescue mission would have several stages to it. We could call them, and this is my language, not the Bible's, we could call them the first days, the middle days, and the last days. Stage 1, the first days, the early days. In the early days, God's rescue mission was this. This is what He was doing. Having broken humanity up into more than 100 people groups, God would take one nation under wing, and He would teach them and train them and discipline and prepare them. He would reveal His word to them and teach them His will so that He could then use them to speak as a mouthpiece to the world and give them a glimpse of the goodness and beauty and truth of God. And some of you right now listening to this are having lights go on. Maybe in a way you never have before as you thought about the Old Testament. Because this is what happens in the Bible in Genesis chapter 12. Only God doesn't start with one nation. No, He creates a nation from scratch. It's like me in a pie the other day. I didn't have my cornstarch or cream of tartar. I didn't know what to do. God starts with one man, one woman, Abraham and Sarah, whom He calls into His service. I want you to look at what God says to Abraham in their very first conversation. And I want you to see in what God says to Abraham the original echoes of God's plan for this earth to fill it with His glory. Genesis 12, verse 3, God says to Abraham, I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. Now listen close to the next words. In you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. Genesis 12, these words I've just read, my friends, are one of the most important verses in the Bible. They are a key to understanding how the Bible all fits together, Old Testament and New, and they're a key to help us understand the whole and full unfolding of human history. From Abraham came that promised nation, that chosen nation, Israel. And in the early days of her story, we see the nation conceived through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, then growing in the womb of Egypt, then brought to birth when Egypt's water broke at the Red Sea. Then Israel weaned and taught and trained in the crib of the wilderness of Sinai, before at long last she takes her place as a fully formed adult nation among the world, on the world stage. That's the early days. Then came the middle days, as this adult nation now steps out onto the world stage, and through Israel, God gave to the world these amazing gifts. I want you to write this down. I'm summarizing about 1,000 pages of the Old Testament in a paragraph. God gave to the world through Israel His laws, through which He taught the world its need for being rescued from evil. God then gave to the world through Israel His Word, through which He taught the world how to prepare for its rescue, how it should seek God, know God, please Him, worship Him. Through Israel, God gave to the world then His priests and His sacrifices. I'll give you a second to write that down. His priests and His sacrifices, which paints a beautiful picture for the world of how its rescue from evil would be achieved. Through Israel, God gave to the world then His prophets, who prepared Israel and the nations for the coming of the one who would accomplish this great rescue. And then at last, the middle days come to fulfillment when God gave to the world through Israel Himself, the Messiah, the long-promised deliverer, to rescue us from the power of sin. We're talking, of course, about Jesus Christ and the events that we celebrated just last week with Easter, the life, death, and resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ. And from that point on, drum roll please, we entered the last days. Hebrews 1 verse 1 says, long ago, many times, in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets, but in these last days, He has spoken to us by His Son, whom He appointed the heir of all things. You say, why are these the last days? Because the work needed to rescue us is finished. Now one thing remains, to take the message of this rescue and the Savior who accomplished it to the world. And once this message, this gospel, this good news reaches every shore, every nation, every tribe, every tongue. Well, Jesus said it Himself at the end of the passage we read from Matthew 24, and this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world, and then the end will come. Now, as we wrap up, I'm not dim. I know many of you are thinking right now, Pastor Barry, you didn't answer our original question. Well, I did, but I know what you meant. And now that you understand kind of the biblical underpinnings of what we're saying, maybe you want to rephrase the question. Maybe the question that's really on your heart, and what you want to do is you want to have an Antichrist of the Month conversation, don't you? What you're really asking is, are we in the last days of the last days? And that will be part 2 of our conversation next week. Why is knowing all this important? And this was a unique and different type of message. I said that at the beginning, and it's reflected by your note sheet. I want you to have all these verses and all these principles in front of you for to look at. This is a lot of information to process. Many of you have never heard or seen the big picture of all this put together in this way. So why is all of this important? Well, that's what I want you to discuss in your life groups this week. This is what I want you to think about in your Bible study this week. But let me jumpstart the conversation as we wrap up. For me, there are 3 ways, at least, and there are many more, but 3 ways that this flyover and thinking about it and rehearsing it in my mind helps me, helps stabilize my heart in a time of trouble. First, it reminds me that God is fulfilling a plan that He has marked out since the beginning of time. God is fulfilling a plan, as you're writing that out, that He's had in place since the beginning of time. And we can see with our own eyes how God has brought to pass each section, each stage of this plan right after another. And so knowing this, standing back and seeing this should encourage our hearts today, that we are going to sail through this storm that we're now in. All we can see right now are the clouds that are imprisoning us. All we can feel is the wind and rain on our face. All we can hear is the thunder. But my friends, high above this storm right now, containing it, is an ocean of calmness, an ocean of power, is an ocean of love and grace, all contained within the heart of God. Job confessed to God in the midst of his own storm. If you know his story. Job said this in Job 42:2, I know that you can do all things and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Dear ones, take hold of that thought today. Whatever you're feeling this morning, God's working out His purposes, and He's not going to forget about us. Second, this teaching today, doing this flyover, is helpful to me because it reminds me of how it all ends. That when it all ends, the earth will be filled with the glory of the Lord. Knowing the ending of things, that's going to be okay, often helps us when we go through difficult stretches where there's suspense. And I'll sometimes watch sports videos from my teams in the past, games I know how they turned out, and they were pretty scary games. It's fun to do that, knowing how it ends. The darkest of night ends if only you hang on long enough. And Isaiah said that, "For behold, darkness will cover the earth, thick darkness the peoples. But the Lord will arise upon you, and His glory will be seen upon you." My friends, we've seen the end of the book, and we know how it ends. God wins. Evil is defeated. The meek will inherit the earth. The Bible hasn't lied to us about any one of His promises, and Jesus never lied to us once. That should give us confidence as we are still wrapping our brains around things that have been promised that have not yet been fulfilled. Grab hold of it. We know how this ends. The third encouragement I received from this teaching is the reminder that God has a great work for me to do. He calls me to use my gifts, my passions, my talents to fill this earth, you can say it with me by now, with His beauty, His goodness, His love, His truth. And now isn't a time to stop. This was to be our original purpose. On a perfect world, this is what we would have done. And it remains our purpose still. Ephesians 2:10, "For we are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand for us to walk in." Now's not a time to stop this. Now's not a time to go run under the bed and cower. No. These are your marching orders. It's what Grandma always told us to do. Leave things better than you found them. So, my friends, until you feel a tap on your shoulder and you look around and it's Jesus smiling and saying, "You can put this down now. Let's go home." Until that happens, keep working, keep serving, keep loving others in His name.